Welcome to our talk today. We're so glad you could take a few minutes to watch our latest presentation. We're here to talk to you about some research that Philippe and I have been doing over the last year or so. So first off, who are we? We're a bunch of hackers that work for McAfee Enterprise Advanced Threat Research Team. We've been doing this a combined a little over 20 years. And if you'd like to look at some of our past or future research, please feel free to follow us on social media. So what are we here to talk about today? Well, we decided to do some research into something called the BBraun Infusomat pump. And what that is that's an infusion pump, which is a device that delivers fluids or medication to a patient through an IV. We looked at two different components of that ecosystem. We looked at the infusion pump itself, which is the picture on the right-hand side, and we also looked at the component called the space station, which is really just a fancy word for a docking station. As you can see in the picture in the center there, it holds approximately 4 pumps at a time. And they run two completely different computer architectures, which we'll get into here in a few moments. Last thing I want to mention about these devices is you might notice that the models that we looked at were released in 2017. In the world of vulnerability research, that can be considered old. However, in the medical industry, device life cycles are much longer. And to make sure that we did our due diligence before our research, we partnered with several industry medical partners and confirmed that these devices are still widely used throughout hospitals around the world and are very predominant devices. I'll touch on this more later. So we're not the first guys to look at things like infusion pumps in the medical industry. I've highlighted two major resources that have happened relatively recently. One is ManiMed, which is a group of German researchers that did a broad overview of medical devices. They did a fantastic job looking at all sorts of devices in the medical industry, including the ones that we looked at today. I will touch on their research here as we go throughout our presentation. And then kind of the research that I like to say started it all was a pacemaker and insulin pump research by Billy Rios and Jonathan Butts from Black Hat 2018. You may be familiar with that presentation. It actually sparked the FDA to create something called the CyberMed Safety Expert Analysis Board. We haven't seen a whole lot of movement on that, but it's a great initiative, and we hope that the FDA continues to move forward with it. So before we dive into maybe the fun stuff and exploitation, we got to start with the beginning. And being the good researchers that we are, we start with just understanding the system design and the architecture. And since we're hardware hackers, the first thing we do when we get a bunch of devices in the lab is we like to take them apart. And so we got a bunch of these different pumps, and we strip them down. And you can see here are a couple of the motherboards from the infusion pumps themselves. And I'm just going to highlight a few common components across the different versions that we looked at. And so you have this microcontroller, which is actually an M32C microcontroller, a bit of a different microcontroller than some of the most common ones. And Philippe's going to dig into this extensively here in a few minutes. Of course, they both have flash chips. So we found various different types of flash chips. We found some TSOP flash chips and some BGA flash chips. And then they have this unique component. It's this plug on the back of the pump, and there's two of them, and they're used for power and CAN bus. So that allows the device to speak to the maintenance software and to gain updates that way as well. So we're going to look at the larger architecture of this ecosystem. And from now on in the presentation, when I talk about the device, we're going to talk about when an infusion pump is docked inside the space station. So it's going to look as one unit. And so this is an architecture diagram of that one unit. I'll highlight just a few key components. So if you notice, we actually got to work with 3 uniquely different architectures, which provided challenges at time. So we have the M32 architecture, we have the PowerPC, and we have an ARM CPU, all within the same ecosystem. And then another critical component is we have this CAN bus, and that's the main link between what I'm going to call the critical operating system, or the RTOS operating system of the pump itself, and the SpaceCom operating system of the network connected component. I also may refer to it as the communication module. And these components exist in both the pump and the space station. If we zoom in on the applications for a moment, Philippe and I got to dig into just about every single one of these, but we do not have time to cover that today. So we're going to focus on two main applications that are important for the critical attack chain. We've got the JSON dbus bridge. This is actually an open source application that listens on standard 80 and 443 ports for GET and POST requests, and it's mostly used for Wi-Fi configuration. And then we also have the PCS process, which frankly, I have no idea what that stands for, but I can tell you that it's used mostly to process commands from the network, which is a proprietary protocol, by default listening on port 1500. And it's used for things like updating drug libraries, calibration data, and pump settings. Now, this protocol is in plain text, and this will become important later, and we'll come back to this. So if you can tell from the system architecture, there's kind of two logical separations. And if you haven't figured it out yet, Philippe and I work in two different parts of the world. I'm in the United States in Texas, and Philippe is in France. And so we had to come away to kind of split this project up logically that made sense. And so we split it in those two main components. Philippe became an expert in the critical RTOS system, reverse engineering the M32 architecture, and I became an expert looking at the SpaceCom. And our hope was by looking at these two distinct areas that we would come together and be able to find a critical attack chain across the entire system. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Philippe, who's going to take a deep dive into that M32 architecture.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So my part was focusing on the pump firmware, and this can be split in kind of like multiple angles. So first we want to get started, and figure like how to start basically, and then when we're good with that, we can start like figuring out like what's interesting inside the firmware. And after that, we can abstract that a little and look at what we could pawn inside that firmware. So I'm going to start looking at the getting started part, and it's split in two directions. One is just recover like a bunch of documentation, and then like another angle is like dumping the firmware and importing that in IDA. So I'm going to talk about dumping the firmware first. On the left side, that's the motherboard of the pump. And on the right side, it's the same, but like inside the BGA workstation under like a lot of heat to remove the flash chip. If you don't have a BGA workstation at home, you can always use like a heat gun to do that, and that works pretty well as well. So if we look on the next slide, we can see like the flash chip has been removed and not cooked. And on the right side is a firmware dump of a flash dump, sorry, of the content of that chip. At first, we weren't quite sure what was on it. But at least we can see like a null pointer string at the bottom of the screenshot, and that's a good sign that we're looking at code stuff. So next logical step is to import it in IDA. Lucky for us, IDA support M32C/80. The one we have is M32C83, which is close enough. It's going to be the same disassembly language. It's just different peripherals and that kind of things. IDA likes to ask hard questions, and in that case, it's like, oh, what's the load address of your firmware? If you have like an ELF binary, it's going to find it for you, but when it's a firmware blob, it's different, so you need to tell it where to load it in memory. Usually the common way is to look for like absolute addresses, like for strings or pointers or function pointers and whatnot, and that will give you a hint of what's the best candidate. In our case, we had like documentation, as I mentioned, and especially the datasheet, so we can look at that. On the left side, it's like just regular like datasheet. On the center, we have the software manual, and it's like all nice and tells you about all the wonderful instruction of the M32C, like all the assembly instruction. And on the right side, we have the hardware manual that goes into like more technical details, like timing and peripherals and registers and that kind of things. So all really useful stuff. But if we deep dive in the hardware manual, we find that nice map. There's like a lot of things going on there, but it tells us different mode of operation of the processor and where what are the loading addresses for different things. So we can see in red potential addresses for external spaces, which would be basically where like a flash could be mapped in memory. So we have like a list of addresses, and if we look on the next slide, we have that nice information as well from the datasheet that at the bottom of the memory map, you're going to have a bunch of function pointers, like a reset vector and whatnot. And so we know that if we load it at the right address, we will see them. And that's what happened when we load it at address E000. We can see on the screenshot like a bunch of function pointers, and if we click on them, it actually leads to code with proper function epilogue and prologue and all of that. And I just named the function based on what was on the datasheet. And as an extra bonus, if we look elsewhere in the firmware, we can find many references to that same address of E0 and neighbor addresses, and that's a good indication that's where interesting things are and valuable information. So we can summary that in the green khaki things on the left side is data. You would find, I don't know, like a font, for instance, for display on screen, translation for the menus, disposable data, calibration data, and so on. It's all the files of the pump, basically. On the right side, on the other hand, you have blue, which means code in IDA. And it's something that I think is really interesting is there is actually two chunks of code and the gap between them that I've highlighted with this purple arrow. So we have a main application, and then we have a bootloader code. And I think it's just really interesting to be able to to see that just by looking at how the memory is laid out. And on top of that, there's also segments that we could define in IDA. The special function registers were already there, and that's for the peripherals, and I will revisit that in a sec. And I think the most important one was the global memory, which was a segment I had to create, and it's actually used by the firmware for all the global variables used by the main application. So by creating that segment, we can then cross-reference stuff and also relabel all of those. So that's extremely useful and important. So that's basically where we get started, and we have all stuff nice and in IDA. But then we want to start looking and understanding how the firmware works. And for that, there is kind of two angles. One is we can look at peripherals, and the other is just clicking around in IDA and see if we see anything fun in it. I'm going to start with peripherals. And why is that cool? It's because that's how the firmware communicates with the rest of the world. So, other components on the board or outside systems and so on. So the datasheet tells us that we can find UART, CAN bus, lots of IOs, analog and digital to analog converters. So that's all really interesting things for us to look into. But how would you find the code responsible for processing these? There's two possible ways. One is the SFR and one is the interrupt handlers. So the SFR is for special function registers, and I have a screenshot on the right of a part of the datasheet about that. And basically it's a special memory range from 0 to 400. And you can read and write to this location like you would normally do, but it's actually a proxy to actually interact with peripherals. So to give an example, if we look at the UART, for instance, there is a special register that if you read from it, is going to retrieve data that was sent over UART. And if you write to it, it would send data over UART. And there will be a configuration registers as well, where you could change the baud rate if you write to it. And the good thing about that is they can be cross-refed in IDA. So, if you go to the right location and press X, it's going to tell you all the places that are touching the UART. So it's extremely useful for reversing, and given that it's given, the addresses are given in the data sheets or the hardware manual, it's really handy. The other one is the interrupt handlers. The address of the interrupt table is stored in the INB register of the M32C processor. And it's basically a big table that is full of functions that get triggers when something interesting happens. So it can be there is data on the UART or the CAN, or a timer triggers and that kind of stuff. If we look at the next slide, we can see that there is tons of them. It's kind of overwhelming. But if we look on the next slide, that's how it's actually implemented in the firmware. And so we can see a bunch of FFFF in many locations, and it just means those interrupts are not implemented. But the ones that are actually implemented are all extremely useful because that's our entry point for really interesting stuff. For instance, back to the UART example, if we look at the next slide, we can see really simple code. I think that was the only one that actually fit in one slide, so that's why I picked that one. But the idea is it checks if it's expecting bytes, UART remain bytes is a global variable. And if it's expecting bytes, it's going to read data from a special function register highlighted in yellow, and it's going to save that in a global buffer. And that part is important. You don't want to spend too much time, like in your interrupt handler, and that's why you're going to have like separate like data structures living in global memory and whatnot that are going to be used by other functions. And so the idea is, if you want to climb up the abstraction layers, like special function registers and interrupt handlers at the bottom. But if you're looking for like the function that would be like serial.send of the main application, you would be more likely to find that by cross-referencing the global buffers and associated structures. So that's the idea. Um, and basically, to summary that, thanks to the documentation that leads us to like SFR and interrupts, we can find a bunch of interesting like peripherals and the code that's like handling them. But now, as I said, this is also like we can just click around in IDA because that's fun and it's different. And I found like a bunch of interesting things, and I wanted to highlight one specifically, which is like the internal database of the device. So that's really interesting because it's used for storing data, but also triggering actions. And that's used both like internally by the firmware itself. Like if a piece of code inside the firmware wants to know what's the patient name, it's going to retrieve that from the database. But it's also exposed on the CAN bus, which is really interesting for us. Um, and the key names in that database can be recovered from like an external like binary, such as the PCS binary that Doug was talking about. So the idea is, otherwise you'd have just like an ID, like a number, but PCS is doing the translation from like the number to like something that you can actually read, which is extremely useful for like reversing, because it gives context. Like when the firmware is retrieving a key in the database, it tells you what it's doing. And then you have like other stuff like, I don't know, like allowed range, like type of data stored in that key. And as I said, the most important one, or the really important one, is callback functions, because certain keys are not really used for like storing data or retrieving data, but more like if you write to that key, is going to trigger an action. And then we can also follow up all of this function and find what interesting things can be triggered. So that's the idea. And there are like other things that were like interesting in our exploration, like a drug library that I will revisit in like 10 minutes. And also like the bootloader that I mentioned, we don't really have time to talk about this one, unfortunately. And another one that was really interesting is like CRCs, because lots of data inside the pump are like CRC'd multiple times to make sure that they are like that the integrity is right. And reversing that was also extremely important and useful, and I will get about that in a minute. But overall, like if we summary that, like we have like all this understanding of the firmware, but that leads to the question in all of that, what could we pawn? So by reversing, like figuring out the UART and the CAN, we got like the IO code and the IO handling code. And one of the hopes was maybe we can find vulnerabilities in like the IO code. But it turns out the pub is doing a really good job at sanitizing the data, making sure things are arriving in the right order, that you cannot like write beyond the bound of a buffer and that kind of things. So at least nothing obvious sticked out. Another like angle I was hoping to find was by finding all the flash code that lets you read and write to the flash, maybe we could find, like the function that does like a firmware update and trigger a rogue firmware update. If you can just do that, you don't really need to like find a vulnerability. You can just modify the firmware. It turns out that the application cannot reflash itself, and only the bootloader can reflash the whole thing. So that would be like an avenue to explore. But instead, we want to like the route of like looking at critical data. So database and drug library and that kind of stuff. And that's nice because, as I said, the database is exposed on the CAN bus, so that's really exciting. However, like the one problem now is like, how do we send messages on the CAN bus? And Doug is going to talk about that now.
So Philippe did all this awesome research on the M32C or critical operating system side, but it's not fruitful if we can't get to it. So we have to go through the networking component of the device in order to be able to access the CAN bus. So as I said earlier, part of the vulnerability discovery process is always the recon phase. And I think this is often quickly overlooked at how valuable it can be when doing vulnerability research. And one of the applications we had was an open source application, the JSON dbus bridge. And because it's open source, we're able to look through different commit logs that are on GitHub to see if there's anything there that would be useful for us trying to exploit this, this process. So we come across this commit message that says fix sending JSON containing percent characters. Now, if you've done vulnerability research very long, if you see something that says percent characters, it triggers a mind of, hold on, what about format string vulnerabilities? And if we look at the commit itself, that's exactly what they're attempting to mitigate here. You can see that there's two calls to printf that are being replaced by a put statement. And they were originally taking JSON, likely directly off the network, and putting it into an object, which is a prime case for format string vulnerability. Now, this was quietly patched and not necessarily ever filed as a CVE or anything, and it was done in 2015. There's a chance, obviously, with our device being from 2017, that this has already been patched. They're using the new version. But you should never underestimate the power of an old vulnerability and should always be checking your products or your targets before it's just shoving it under the rug. And since this is a very simple thing to test, we created a curl request that contained some some format string identifiers, and we are presented back with an error message. However, that error message contains hex characters, and it appears that they could be either addresses or components of memory. Now, as I said earlier in the presentation, Philippe and I are working in two different parts of the world, so we spent a lot of time on like video chat, like Slack and Zoom and all that fun stuff during our research. And I got a picture of Philippe's face when this happened in real time and really thought this was important because it really expresses our feelings when we saw that we were actually able to get memory or hex back in that dump. So needless to say, we now dug in our heels to create a working exploit of this potential format string vulnerability. I must admit this was harder than we actually initially thought it was going to be, doing this completely black box. But there was a couple critical concepts that really helped us out here. So we were able to use the %x format string variable to continuously dump memory, and we dump memory from all over the stack to other areas of other aspects of memory to really get an idea of what the system was laid out as. And then we're able to use the %n format string identifier to overwrite sections of memory. And in this case, being at a PowerPC, we're able to overwrite the PLT. And then we were able to do a classic return libc attack. And we get really excited about all this. We finally get it all working. And I hate to break it to you, but we ended up with user level access, which was a little bit disappointing after putting a lot of time into getting this exploit working, but it was obviously a critical step. And so then we move to the logical next step of privilege escalation. To give you a little bit more background about this device, it has a web interface, and in that web interface, it has a feature for exporting and restoring settings. It's a backup scenario, also allows you to carry settings from one pump to the next. Well, as that function, it creates a tar file. And so when you restore that tar file, though, they don't do any cleaning up of permissions, and so they actually preserve the file system permissions from the tar file. So if we set the setUID bit, for example, for a binary, it's going to be preserved on the restore. And furthermore, what's interesting is during this process, they use a binary called the config export binary. And if we dig into that, as you can see on the hex on the right-hand side, this is actually execving a script itself. So what we ended up doing to get root access is we binary patched the config export to run a different script, an attacker-controlled script, and we therefore restore that with the setUID bit met, and we were able to gain root access. Now I have to give a shout out here to that earlier report that I mentioned, the ManiMed report. They actually were able to report this before we did, and this became a very pivotal component to our attack chain. So kudos to them, and this was a great find. So we've got root, right? Game over, time to pack up and go home. Except for that's not really the ATR way of doing things. So we're able to get root access, but we want to actually leverage a realistic attack scenario. We don't just want to POC that there's root access here. And remember, we have two isolated, for all intents and purposes, operating systems connected by a CAN bus. So the question becomes, can we control the pump's critical operations with root access? It had actually been previously reported by the vendor that that was not a possibility, that root access on Spacecom was not able to influence patient safety. So this gave us extra motivation to see if we were able to hack the patient. And so we start digging into how are we going to accomplish this? Okay, we've got root, we understand about a little bit how the critical OS works. We could You might be considering we could, with root access, directly write to the CAN bus, and we could send our own messages over. And that would be one way to approach the problem. However, Philippe and I like to use a concept called living off the land. And that is, can we use the system's designed functionality in maybe an unintended way to leverage the applications on the system to do what we want instead of kind of reinventing the wheel? If we were to write CAN messages, we'd have to understand the format, we'd have to understand the conversation from one side to the next. If we're able to leverage existing infrastructure, it becomes a lot easier. And so we have this PCS binary we've been talking about previously, and we know that that's communicating back and forth between the two sides. So I dug into the PCS binary to see what we could find that would be helpful. Now, I must admit, I had things a little bit easier than Philippe, as I was working with a C++ application, and I had a bunch of hints inside to make things a little bit easier. One would be, now I did not have symbols, but I had a lot of debugging log statements. And in those log statements actually contained names of functions. And names of functions can be very descriptive and helpful to understanding what's going on in an application. So here, for example, we have the function prepare data upload. The other thing that I had that was useful was C++ type information. So remember what our goal is here. Our goal is to leverage PCS in some manner to talk on the CAN bus to the other side. Well, we find these objects called CAN operator objects, which was a great clue that these might be objects in memory that we could leverage to speak to the CAN bus. And if we look at the vtable for the pump config CAN operator and we combine that with our ability to use the logging statements, we can actually get a really good general idea of what functions do what for each one of these operators and how we can leverage that to speak on the CAN bus. And last, certainly not least, we can look at and understand the main functionality of this application, which is to receive network commands. So this is the switch statement that we cleaned up a little bit using those context clues that receives incoming network traffic and then processes that networking traffic. Now remember that networking traffic is in clear text, so using that we're able to actually name these commands, and we break them down into two general categories. For the most part, we have upload and download commands, and they're going to generate the respective CAN operators to need on the others to talk to the other side. So if we look about the upload commands, that's what requires us to provide something to the pump. Well, if we have to provide something to the pump, we have to understand what it expects, potentially go through validation, and that sounds like a lot of work. But if we use the download commands, that's not expecting anything from us. We're asking something from the pump. And if that's the case, it's still going to communicate over the CAN bus and provide the objects that we need. And even more specifically, we can find this command called the download pump config command, which lo and behold creates a pump config CAN operator. And so if we put all this together, we're able to construct a call chain of what is necessary in order to make a read or write command on the critical operating system from the SpaceCom unit. So we first have to activate something called service mode, and this just means that we have the appropriate permissions to make changes. Then we have to disable the write protection by disabling flash protection. Then we're going to be able to, we have to have that pump config CAN operator object, but we know how to create one by simply sending a download pump config command. And since the pump's not authenticating us, an attacker is able to do that. And then we want to write to it or read from it, and we can use set service data to do that, and then we simply set everything back in reverse by re-enabling the flash and deactivating service mode. So great, now we have that understanding. We know how to bridge the gap between the networking aspect or the communication module of SpaceCom and the critical RTOS system. And so if we were actually a malicious entity, that would be time to write malware. Remember, we have root access, so writing malware that can hook processes is fair game. However, we can kind of cheat since we're not actually trying to weaponize this, and we can use GDB and have that act as our malware. There's nothing that GDB can do that you couldn't do with malware as long as you had root access. So we're going to use GDB attached to PCS, put a breakpoint so we're able to capture that pump config CAN operator object, and then we can use the GDB interface to execute function calls to modify data. Great, we know exactly what we need to do, except for now there's the complicated question of what do we want to write and where the heck do we write it? It's kind of like doing a GOT overwrite in exploitation. It's great that you have the capability to do it, but until you know what to write where, it's not very useful. And so for this, I have to turn this back over to the wizard himself in order to explain to us how does the critical data in this system work.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So we were like in that situation where we wanted to mess with some data on the pump, but the question was like, yeah, what can we mess with? One of the like a safety net to avoid like improper like dosing when like a nurse enter like information on the pump. And so it's a solid safety net, but there's also like lots of data structure to reverse. And one of the realization we came into is probably most of the things that the drug library like could hold is something that's going to be shown on screen. And in the process, like nurses or doctors are expected to double check that the value on screen matches what's on their like medical sheet. So if we can remove, like safety measures, well, we might, but that would still rely on, external errors to have like important impact. So we also looked into something else, which is the calibration data and disposable data. Those are like internal parameters that kind of govern how the device function, and those are not exposed to the end user. It's more meant for like servicing and configuring the device itself. So by being invisible to the end user, that's much more likely to be able to tamper with something that would remain unnoticed for longer. So to share some of our like nice results, we, um, we can look on the next slide. We have, that's a screenshot from Kaitai, which might be a little confusing at first, but basically it's a tool. It's kind of like IDA for reversing data structure. So you can type, you understand your data type, and it's automatically going to parse like the data you provide following those patterns. So it's extremely useful for both understanding the data and making sure like when you're reversing like a data structure, you like understand correctly what it's doing, and you can verify that on live data. So like in that screenshot, I was passing strings, and that leads to that nice result where we were like able to patch like a word name inside the drug library, fix all of the required CRCs, and push that to the pump, and it would actually accept it and display our like our name on it. So that's a really nice proof of concept that shows that we could tamper with the drug library, and if we wanted, we could like alter like the soft limits built in and remove some protections. So that's enough to show like impact, but it was just nicer to like show our name on the screen. The limitation of that, as I said, is we pretty much only can modify things on screen, so that's limited in that regard. The other angle was the disposable data, which is basically like the recipe for the pump to know how to handle like specific infusion tubes. It's the same as if you had a printer and it had to know like, oh, is it like an A4 letter or like A4 paper or letter size paper and that kind of stuff. On the left side, it's a shot of the disposable data, and all of those values are actually keys in the database I was talking about. The most interesting one that sticks out to us is the tube head volume, because it's basically the volume of the tube itself, and that's how the pump knows every time it's like squeezed to like push the drug in through the tube, it knows the volume that's being pushed. The pump itself doesn't know the volume by some measuring tools, and instead it needs to be told every time you squeeze that much volume. So if you tamper with that value, which is used for like calculation, it's going like the pump is just going to do like completely wrong math, and it's going to end up in over or under delivery of the drug. So just as a quick summary of like all the whole process, you can see on the right side dog ready to like hack the patient, and he's going to get that in a sec. But what we're going to do is modify disposable data, and specifically the tube head volume. This is stored in the flash memory, and we interact with that through the internal database. And to do so, using PCS and being instrumented with GDB, we can issue our own sense service data that actually writes keys to the database and basically issue like CAN messages that reaches to the pump. The requirement for making that working is we had to account for multiple CRCs because that's the disposable data has like multiple like CRC to make sure its integrity is okay. And so we had to reverse that and reverse the data structure of those, which was like pretty tricky. And also we had to first erase the existing data, disposable data stored on the flash, because otherwise it just overwrite in place and everything gets mangled. And we did break one pump and barely managed to salvage a second one. And then we understood what was going on and we were like able to move on. But it was a little stressful at first. But yeah, so now Doug is going to show you the actual hacking process in progress.
Right. So now we understand what data we need to modify. So we have the vehicle to get initial access to the device. We have the method to speak over the CAN bus to send commands to the other side, and we know what we want to change. So the best way to really culminate this and to understand what needs to happen is to simply show you a demo video of this going on. So here what we have is we have the pump and we've set it up as a base case. So this is going to show exactly what should happen in normal operations. So we're following the manual, the recommended guidance on how to use this device. So first we're going to load it. We're going to load an IV line into the pump, and we've got it set up with 50 milliliters of drug or liquid, if you will. For our test cases, we're just using water. And we're going to use a very basic infusion. So we're going to use 100 milliliters an hour with 1,000 VTBI or volume to be infused. And we're going to start the pump, and we're going to see over just a few minutes how much drug is released. And our expected result would be that the amount of drug that the pump reports being released is exactly what's being released. And we can see this here by looking at the vial of how much drug is gone and what the pump is reporting, and it's pretty clear that it's approximately the same, about 5 milliliters. Well, now we want to leverage the attack chain that Philippe and I have created to see if it actually makes any difference on the pump. So we're first going to use some Python scripts we created to exercise that format string vulnerability, to gain root privileges, to create an SSH session, to load the tools we need to use GDB to hook into the PCS binary. And so then we need to send the network command over the network to create that pump config can operator object that we talked about. Again, that's unauthenticated, so it works for us. And now we're going to read into that database that Philippe was mentioning and just check to see what the value is. So it looks like it's 15C for that tube head volume. Now the attacker is going to first erase and rewrite the database with the values that they would like in there. And as you can see on the right, those lights are flashing on the pump, indicating the pump is in service mode, which, by the way, it was supposedly that you can't do that remotely. So here we are, the attacker is rewriting the database to their desired values, and they're making sure to set that tube head volume to what they would like it to be. The attacker is then going to reboot the pump, and they're doing this to ensure that their changes take effect, but also there'll be some notifications that are triggered that changes have happened, and we want to clear them to make sure that staff is actually not notified that anything's changed. And now we're going to take a second look at that database. We're going to read to see what the value is for tube head volume. And what we're going to get back is a new value of 0AE. And for hex math, that literally means we have half of what we had originally. So now we want to run our same basic test case again and make sure that we follow the exact same procedures, being a good scientist that we are, to see if we have a different conclusion. So once again, we're going to set up the pump following the manufacturer guidelines on how to use the device. We're going to load a new infusion, and we're going to set it up to the same test that we had before of 100 milliliters an hour with 1,000 VTBI, or volumes to be infused. Now we should see the exact same result we saw before, but if our changes have done anything, we'll see a different result. And you can very quickly already start to see there is a big difference between what the pump is reporting and what's actually happening. And by the time we take a snapshot at the exact same point in time, the pump will have reported 5 milliliters where we've actually dispensed 10 milliliters of medication to a patient. So we are successfully able to remotely compromise the pump and make a change that is effective to the patient. So what does that mean in the context of these devices? Well, we're able to manipulate the dosage, and once again, we want to make sure that our research is correct and relevant as possible. So we're going to consult industry experts. And so one of the experts we consulted, Dr. Sean Nordic, really helps us to understand that it doesn't really take much in modifying medication delivered to a patient to cause very big harm to a patient and potentially even death. And if we zoom out for a minute and we don't go as far as modifying medication that's being delivered to a patient, with root access on Spacecom, we would be able to install ransomware, which we see increasingly over the last couple of years being more and more used in the medical space. In fact, one example of that is in October of 2020 at the Vermont Medical Center, where 75% of all chemo patients had to be turned away due to the fact that of a ransomware attack. So what does this all kind of culminate to? You know, Philippe and I have done a lot of different vulnerability research, and we correlate this compared to other medical research done. What are some trends that we're seeing? And here I've got some common pitfalls that we're seeing in the medical industry when it comes to security, and I'm just going to cover a couple really quick. And one is I want to go back to that device lifecycle I talked to in the beginning. You know, we mentioned that this device was from 2017 and still in use. And this is a big issue in the medical industry. We've got devices that are still in use from 2008, and that causes legacy vulnerabilities to still be in existence. And part of that is because patching is costly. And when I say costly, I mean financially. This isn't like updating your Windows 10 box where, you know, you just get a new update and it's automatically installed. A lot of times this requires the devices to be decommissioned or sent back to vendors or pulled out of service, and that can cost a hospital or medical facility millions of dollars. And so hospitals really have to kind of prioritize what they're able to patch, and they can't always do it often. So, you know, we threw a lot of information out there today. In case you fell asleep or you just want the highlights, this is what we ended up discovering. Is we have 5 CVEs, the highest being a 9.7, that allows us to remotely compromise the BBraun infusion pump, which exploitation can lead to overdosing or underdosing a patient. Infusion pumps are insanely popular. In a year's time, $54 billion worldwide are done in sales in infusion pumps. Mitigations for medical devices are hard, but most importantly, hacking around the world with your friends is a whole lot of fun. So we're happy that you sat through our talk today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media and also visit our webpage where we have a lot of our other research. Thank you again and have a nice day.
Thank you all.